Willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 50 of my game system design series videos. In this video I'll be investigating game scales and the issues associated with aligning scales and changing scales. Many sets of rules will try and avoid the issue of scale by only providing a vague idea of the game scale being used. However, game scale and aligning the different scales have a major impact on gameplay and historical realism. This video, unlike some of my other videos, is more a discussion video based on a number of recent games that I've had. I have no rules or game aids to present, but I do have some guides for players who wish to alter the scale of their favourite set of rules in order to reproduce a larger battle than would typically be allowed or permitted. When we delve into the area of scales, there are a number of game scales which designers need to consider. These are ground scale, game turn scale, and troop scale. Ground scale is what does a given distance on a playing area represent in real distant terms. Thus, at a scale of 1 in 10,000, each 1 centimetre represents 100 real metres. Game turn scale is what time duration does a game turn represent. For example, if the game turn scale is 60 minutes, then what occurs in a game turn represents what is possible in a 60-minute period. Finally, we come to the most vague, and that is troop scale, or basically, what does a figure element of units represent in terms of numbers of men and weapons? This often varies by troop type, but for example, the Bloody Big Battle set of rules uses a troop scale of 1 in 1,000, or each element represents 1,000 men. Other rules use the figure, such as WRG. Each figure represents 50 men. These three scales are well understood by experienced gamers, but what is often less understood is the ramification of aligning the different scales together. An example of the alignment of scales is as follows. A man can walk about 5,000 metres in an hour. If in formation, this will reduce perhaps to 2,000 metres in an hour. Other factors can even reduce this again, but will mainly focus on Napoleonic warfare. Thus, at a ground scale of 1 in 10,000, an infantry element can cover 20 centimetres in an hour. If the game designer selects a game turn scale of 6 minutes per game turn, the infantry can only cover 2 centimetres per game turn. If a game turn scale of 120 minutes is selected, the infantry can now move 40 centimetres in formation and is significantly more if in travel mode. The former alignment results in almost no movement, while the latter allows the unit to cover the entire playing area in a single game turn. There are valid reasons where this scale match could be desired, but generally you do not wish an infantry element to move more than 3 or 5 times the element width, which means with 4 centimetre wide elements and a scale of 1 in 10,000, a game turn scale of 60 minutes is optimal. This game turn scale can be appropriate for a ground scale of 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 15,000, but once outside those ground scale ranges, you need a very specific game system reason to allow this kind of alignment. The other common ratios to look at is ground scale and troop scale. If our element of musketeers represents 200 men, then that will tell us its maximum width. If in line, 3 men occupy a frontage of 60 centimetres or 20 centimetres per man. This means the element width has a width of 40 metres. In column it will be less, but as columns would normally have gaps between them, this may also apply. So let's just focus on line. If the element has a width of 4 centimetres, then each 1 centimetre equals 10 metres, or a ground scale of 1 in 1,000. Cavalry occupies about 1 metre. Thus, cavalry in 2 lines occupies 500 centimetres per horse when in formation, so a 40 metre wide base can accommodate 80 cavalry. Artillery would typically occupy about 10 metres per gun, depending on the size of the gun, so you could expect 4 guns to occupy 40 metre frontage. One common area where issues do arise is when the ground scales are very large or very small. If the element scale is 1 in 2,000, then each element represents 400 metre frontage. If using 4 centimetre wide elements, the ground scale becomes 1 in 10,000. If you're dealing with Napoleonic warfare where muskets may have an effective range of 100 metres, the firing range now becomes 1 centimetres. If we deal with artillery, which could have ranges of 900 metres to 1800 metres, the range becomes 9 centimetres to 18 centimetres, which does seem a lot more reasonable. If you change the troop scale to 1 in 200, then the ground scale becomes 1 in 1000, which means muskets can now fire up to 10 centimetres and artillery from 90 to 180 centimetres. The artillery can now cover most of the playing area. The musket range means opposing forces will probably need to start 30 centimetres away from each other, which means there is minimal, if any, manoeuvring. The rules have to align with these ranges and conditions. Now that we've covered the basis or basics of scale, there is a final scale which determines all the rest. One scale to rule them all, so to speak. This is what scale of conflict do you wish to reproduce? Is it skirmish? Is it corps per side? Or is it an entire Napoleonic battle? If we first look at battles, these could range from 10,000 men per side to over 100,000 men per side. Leipzig involved 195,000 French troops against 365,000 Allied troops. On the other hand, Marengo involves 28,000 French against 30,000 Austrians. 1814 has even smaller battles, with Monte Mirali consisting of 10,500 French against 18,000 Russians. Smaller skirmishes did also occur. The Battle of Mir consisted of 3,000 French, actually mainly Polish Uhlans, against 9,000 Russians. The issue with these smaller conflicts is getting accurate information about them, as well as consisting of unusual troop mixes. However, they are possible if you want to reproduce them. Other options including only dealing with a small part of a large battle, such as the French Third Corps attack at Wagram. For this video, I'll mainly focus on battles, with a small battle being Marengo, a medium one being Austerlitz, and a large one being Leipzig. Before I cover the troop scales, I need to cover another important factor. How long and large do you wish your game to be? If you wish to complete your game within a 4-hour period, you need to limit each side to about 50 elements. I call this the 50 element rule, and I got this from World War II Spearhead's set of rules. The rule ends up being surprisingly accurate for almost any period. It can be modified when using movement trays and even multi-element units, but it's a reasonable limit or guideline for our purposes. The playing area size is perhaps not so important, as having a large playing area when using very low scales probably is optimal, but as we increase the troop scale, the size of the playing area is dramatically affected. Players who like 8-hour games simply need to double the number of elements. Multi-day games need no upper limit. This shows a rather basic table, but gives you an idea of the army size based on the troop scale and the battles you may be expected to be able to refight. The actual battles all involved more men, so this is rounded upwards. This is very basic, and cavalry and artillery will increase your element count significantly, but it's a reasonable guide. I'll first pick as an example a troop scale of 1 in 1000. This would allow you to fight battles where each side ranged from 35,000 men to 75,000 men per side. This would cover all but the largest and smallest battles of the Napoleonic War. The ground scale depends on the width of the element, as each element would have a nominal frontage of 200 metres. The scales range from 1 in 5,000 to 1 in 10,000. The time scale I use is based on infantry moving 4 base widths in a typical game turn. Road movement would be greater. This would be in formation or under fire. Thus, infantry would be able to move 800 metres at this troop scale. This gives us a game turn scale of about 30 minutes, which could range from 20 minutes to 40 minutes. This is a very basic and brief summary of the ratios you need to consider when setting your scales. The next step is how can you change the scales? For my example, I'll use bloody big Napoleonic battles. BB&B uses 1-inch wide bases, or 2.5 centimetres. As I live in a metric world, I use 3 centimetre wide bases instead, but 2.5 centimetres would also be viable. Each base width, which is normally 1 inch, represents from 150 to 250 yards. This represents a scale of 1 in 5,400 to 1 in 9,000. Based on the movement rate, the average scale is probably 200 yards, or 1 in 7,200 ground scale. Each game turn represents 60 minutes, but can range from 30 minutes to 120 minutes. If we just stay with a 60-minute game turn, we would expect infantry to be able to cover 2,000 metres, or from 8 to 14 base widths. The movement rate is 12 inches, which does align with the game turn length. Personally, I find this a very long game turn at this scale, but these rules use zones of control and orders, so movement is restricted in a historical manner in other ways. As I own standard base 15mm figures, the element size I typically use is half a standard element of 4 centimeters. Each physical element represents 2 BBNB elements. In BBNB, the elements are 1-inch squares, so this closely aligns with the original rules. The only issue is you need to keep track of odd casualties. This gives us a ground scale of 1 in 10,000 with 60-minute game turns. In this scale, converting each inch in the original game, which is equal to a base width, becomes 2 centimeters. Thus 12-inch movement rates converts into 24 centimeters. This works well and aligns as closely as possible with the original rules. But how can you change scales if you so desire? If a player wanted to reproduce for Gram, the number of elements each side would exceed 100. This makes for a rather large game. The playing area would need to be as large as perhaps 6 by 8 feet, which is viable but makes for a large playing area. How can you halve the number of elements and the playing area size without breaking the rules? Just as an incidental note, the way BBNB works, this is probably more than suitable because it uses multi-element units, but let's just follow the 50-element rule for now. The simplest method is to change the troop scale to 1 in 2,000, which halves the number of elements and doubles the ground scale. The playing area is now a manageable 3 by 4 feet, and the number of elements per side range from 50 to 75 elements per side. Now we have an interesting choice. As the ground scale is doubled, all movement allowances are halved. Or do the game turn scale need to be changed and thus is doubled? As each 2 centimetre wide element represents 2,000 men, which has a frontage of 400 metres, we have a few things to consider. This is double the standard frontage, so if the movement rate remains the same, which is 12 centimetres, the infantry is travelling twice the distance as you would expect in a 60-minute game turn. The cleanest solution is to halve movement by assuming each 1 inch is now half an inch, or 1 centimetre is half a centimetre. The number of game turns remain the same, it's just all the distances are now halved. The other option is to keep all distances for movement the same and halve the number of game turns. This will cause game system issues and is probably not an optimal system or method, but it is possible. You may ask, if it's not optimal in this situation, why am I raising it all? This is a good question, and the answer is the other system may in some circumstances not be a particularly good solution. One issue of reducing the movement distances is the distances can get so small as to be difficult to play a game. In this example, our infantry elements can move 6 centimetres, which is a small distance, but it's an easy distance to measure and it's not excessively small. If the movement allowances were much smaller and movement started to be less than an element width, we start moving into a scale mismatch where there is almost no movement. I'll deal with another set of rules where this is a more viable solution. That is, halving the game turns rather than halving the distances. One important point to note, whatever you do, the fire ranges are always reduced to match the ground scale. So artillery in this example would be expected to fire from 8 centimetres to 16 centimetres, but musket fire would be a rather low 1 centimetre. Some rules fudging may be required in this case. However, BBNB uses a base width zone of control to represent musket fire, which means it's 3 centimetres. A small distance, but not unmanageable if you decide to halve it. For my next example will be Napoleon at War, or Grosse Schlachten, a figure game version of board game by SPI. The board game uses highly variable scales in order to cover battles from Marengo to Leipzig. Thus, its basic game system is well suited to variable scales. The rules support a wide range of scales, but I'll look at these 3 basic scales initially. The rules, because it's based on a board game, uses hexes originally, and for the figure game version I use base widths for movement and fire range. Thus, this assumes you're using a base width of 4 centimetres. There are 3 troop scales from 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 4,000. Each troop scale impacts game turn scale and ground scale accordingly. These rules do not have a fire range, to any extent. Only artillery has a fire range. The game system accommodates this, so for these rules there is no need to change fire ranges if you decide to change scale. Looking at a set of World War II and Cold War rules, in this case a figure game version of the SPI Modern Battles board game, once again this game system is designed to allow for different scales, although not as much as the Napoleonic rules. Unlike Napoleonic figure gaming, most World War II and Cold War uses a base size of 3 centimetres wide. The larger 15 figures use a larger base size, but apart from this there is minimal need to concern yourself with different element sizes. However, scaling up and scaling down in order to refight smaller or larger conflicts is a reasonably trivial affair. Thus, the default ground scale of 1 in 60,000 can easily be scaled down to 1 to 20,000 or scaled up to 1 in 180,000. The final period that I want to cover is Ancients, or to be more accurate, from 3000 BC to 1599 AD. This is once again a figure game version of the SPI pre-Stags board game. These rules also support a wide range of scales, as the battles could vary from 100,000 men per side to 5,000 men per side. The standard scale being used is 1 to 5,000, and this covers most battles, but for smaller conflicts the scale can be easily reduced to 1 in 2,500. When I engage in converting a number of board games into a figure gaming format, such as Modern Battles, Napoleon at War and Pre-Stags, I use the concept of base widths to compensate for the lack of hexes. However, there are other figure gaming rules which also use this concept, that is, base widths for movement and fire range, so it's certainly not a unique system, and I actually copied this from DBMM. The main benefit of using base widths is you can change your base widths, perhaps 3 centimeters or 4 centimeters or even 6 centimeters, and all distances remain consistent with the new figures. There's no need to do any maths. This mainly impacts Ancients and Napoleonics, especially if you're considering 6mm figures on 3 centimeter wide bases. It also allows you to use different basing systems for 15mm Napoleonics with no issues. In simple terms, as long as all figures are based the same, you can use any basing system you wish if the rules use base widths as their measurement. Some rules achieve this with complex conversion charts, but personally this simple concept allows you to achieve this objective with no major calculation or complexity or major issues. The only issue is you need to make your own measuring sticks. However, even before I came to this conclusion, that is using base widths, I was already making my own measuring sticks for gameplay purposes, with the movement rates physically on it, which sped up gameplay. This shows a 5 centimeter base width rule set of measures and a 4 centimeter base width rule set of measures. I also use a 3 centimeter base width set of measures, and I may make up a 2 centimeter wide rule for BBNB. I find this such an elegant and simple idea, I never knew why I never used it before. DBN has templates for the creations of these sort of measuring sticks, but the incentives or benefits is not so major. But using a base width system, it is required, and I must admit has made play a lot easier than using my old trusty tape measure. And so this concludes episode 50 of my video series on game design theory, in this case discussing the issue of scale, or the way scale relates to each other. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.